Assalamu alaikum, namaskar, and good evening to all of you. So, on behalf of BASE, I, Mahmudul Hassan Dhabok, welcome you to all in BASE lecture series. So, before I start these sessions, I want to share something about BASE, that is Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment. It is a developmental organization registered as a trust by a collective of academicians, scholars, professional and other like-minded people working for community and social development. I must say that in this pandemic time, BASE has done excellent social work. This lockdown, loss of job, and also devastating impact of Amphan affected West Bengal very badly. In this time, BASE opened more than 25 community kitchens all over West Bengal for Amphan affected poor people, migrant laborer, helpless, street vagabonds. It also distributed triple dry food, medicine, and other related relief items. BASE has helped many migrant laborers to go back their own state. Recently, BASE has distributed education kit for poor and first generation children for little bit encouragement. I must say that base two offices, one is at Central Kolkata near Park Sakas, another is on Koikhali, that is near airport. These two offices are available for the students who are coming from the district for their examinations like NEET, NET, and other related examination and interviews. Also, it is open for also for those people who have no place to stay in the Kolkata, they are coming for the medical emergency. I must say that in this current political, socio-political scenario and backwardness of certain sections, we think that there is a tangible need to organize intellectually. This is an effort to reach out as many as we can in various ways and platform. Primarily, we are building network of related people in higher educations, which is helpful in different ways, especially for information and resource sharings. This create a better linkage among concerned people of various institutions across Bengal, India, and abroad. BASE has been conducting online lecture series since last 2 months. This is BASE lecture series this basic lecture series is a part of larger activities of BASE, which would serve as social awakening, gathering knowledge from different perspectives and other holistic purpose. Today we have BASE lecture series, lecture number 50. It is one type of panel discussions, and the topic is alienating the marginalized impact of National Education Policy 2020. Today we have 6 panelists. So I would request all the participants to turn off their audio and video, and please don't share your screens. If you have any question, write it on the chat box. So now I would request Professor Nargis Ahmed, who is a professor in the Department of Nursing, Alia University, to introduce and welcome today's panelists. So Professor Nargis Ahmed, over to you.
Thank you, Hassan Bhai. Assalamu alaikum, namaskar, and good evening to all of you present here. Today we have gathered here for BASE panel discussion. The topic is alienating the marginalized impact of National Education Policy 2020. On behalf of Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment, it is my privilege to introduce and welcome our moderator and panelists of today's panel discussion. I'm happy and privileged to welcome our moderator of today's panel discussion, Mohammad Manirul Islam, Assistant Professor, Presidency University, Kolkata. Sir has completed PhD from University of Kalyani in 2016. He has started his career as Assistant Professor at Asan Nagar Madan Mohan Tarkalankar College, Nadia, then joined Acharya Jagadish Chandra Bose College, Kolkata. He has also worked as visiting faculty in the Department of English, University of Kalyani. In his more than 10 years of teaching career, he has taught different genres of English literature. He has published and produced monograph, many book chapters, journal articles, seminar proceedings, and course modules under UGC MHRD EPG Pathshala. So we are happy to get you here with us. So on behalf of BASE, I heartily welcome you. Next, I would like to welcome our panelists of today's panel discussion. I'm happy to welcome one of our panelists, Mr. Atindra Kanti Mondol, who has done MTech from IIT Kharagpur and currently pursuing PhD at IIT Bombay. His research specialization is in biosensors. He is well versed in Indian philosophy and Indian history. Thank you, Mr. Atindra Kanti Mondol, for joining BASE panel discussion. Next, I would like to welcome Mr. Adil Rashid Khan, who did his MBA from France and mechanical engineering from Jadavpur University. He is a management consultant, Middle East and Africa. His areas of expertise are corporate strategy management, business plan management, development, greenfield project planning, forecasting, etc. He has another identity, I must say, that he is a kind of social worker. And since 1995, he has been working mostly in education, disaster management, and healthcare related issues. And he is associated with many social organizations. And I must mention that he is one of our BASE member. So thank you, Mr. Adil Rashid Khan, for joining BASE panel discussion. Next, I would like to welcome Ms. Shreya Ghosh, who has completed MPhil from Center of Political Studies, JNU, and presently pursuing her PhD on informal labor. He has been part of student movement. She has been part of student movement and activism for many years. So thank you, Ms. Shreya Ghosh, for joining us today. I'm delighted to welcome one of our another panelist, Sheikh Asif Akram, who has done his master's from IIT Bombay and currently pursuing PhD from the same institution in quantum and theoretical physics. He is founder of Kolkata-based cultural organization NEHAI, as well as Theoretical Physics Journal Club, Department of Physics, IIT Bombay. Thank you, Mr. Asif Akram, for joining us today for today's panel discussion. Last but not the least, I am glad to welcome Mr. Saurya Majumdar, who is pursuing Master in Sociology at JNU, Delhi. So thank you all panelists for joining today's panel discussion. So on behalf of BASE, I heartily welcome once again our moderator of today's panel discussion as well as all panelists. So now, Manirul sir, the session is over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for your kind introduction of the panelists. Okay, so let us try to start our discussion today. আমরা সবাই সত্যজিৎ রায়ের হীরক রাজার দেশে সিনেমাটা দেখেছি। এখন এই হীরক রাজার দেশে আমরা দেখি যে উদয়ন পণ্ডিতের স্কুল, সেখানে রাজার বড় নজর। উদয়ন পণ্ডিতের স্কুলে কি পড়ানো হচ্ছে, কি পড়ানো হবে, কি শেখানো হবে, সেই কন্টেন্টটা রাজা নিয়ন্ত্রণ করতে চায়। এবং আমাদের খুব মনে আছে যে খুব বিখ্যাত কিছু লাইন, লেখাপড়া করে যেই অনাহারে মরে সেই, জানার কোনো শেষ নাই, জানার চেষ্টা বৃথা তাই, এরকম কিছু লাইন। এখন প্রশ্ন হলো যে উদয়ন পণ্ডিতের পাঠশালায় রাজার এত ইন্টারেস্ট কেন? Why the king is so interested in his pathshala? In other words, why the state power is interested in educational institutions? A very good answer, you can say, can be provided if we go back to the 1970 essay by Louis Althusser titled Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. Now, many of us are also familiar with this essay. In the essay, Althusser actually talks about the different state apparatuses and explains how the state power exerts its control over the people through its apparatuses. In other words, how it secures the reproduction of the hegemonic relations of production or ensures the hegemony of the dominant ideology or class. Now he divides the state apparatuses into two groups primarily, the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatuses. Now, talking about the importance of the ideological state apparatuses, Althusser actually first talks about the feudal, the ideological apparatuses of the feudal society, where he identifies two very important state apparatuses, ideological state apparatuses as the church and the family. Now, when it comes to the post-feudal capitalist society, Althusser says the church is replaced by the school or by the educational apparatus. Therefore, it becomes very important for the state power to exercise its control over the educational system. So whether it is Hirak Raja or say the British Raj or the present Rajas, they are primarily targeting the educational system, the educational institutions, because it is through the educational institutions that the state power can, to a large extent, exercise its control. Okay. So basically, when I look at the new education policy, I look at it as a kind of project that aims at controlling and containing the educational institutions the way Althusser talks about it. Now, having said this, let us briefly talk about the ideological underpinnings of NEP. Now, if you take a look at the NEP document, then you'll see that even a casual look will reveal that there are two axes to it, two dimensions, basic ideological dimensions to it. I call one the utopian dimension, the other the utilitarian dimension. Now, the utopian dimension actually derives its force from the belief in the greatness of the Indian antiquity. The Indian antiquity is conceived as if it has always and already been post-modern, I would say post-modern. This idea actually of the Indian antiquity as having its greatness was a creation of the British Orientalists towards the end of the 18th century. It was a kind of imperial project of the British Orientalists. Now, this Orientalist project has been adopted by the present-day right-wing political parties and as you know, the Hindutva forces. Now, there are several problems actually with this utopic term. I would point to one primary problem, and that is it involves a rewriting of history. You can see it reflected in the new NEP document. It ignores long period of Indian history, the cultural exchanges and the syncretic tradition that developed out of it. So any policy that ignores 1,000 years of history or more is problematic in nature and cannot be good for the nation as a whole. Seen from this point of view, the new education policy threatens the diversity that is synonymous with India. Obviously, there are other factors in NEP that also pose a major challenge to the diversity of India as we understand it. the utilitarian aspect of the NEP responds to the demand of the capital. And for me, it has two basic dimensions. One is the framing of the policy based on the demand of the labor market, the capital, which demands production and reproduction of certain kinds of labor force. The second issue is obviously corporatization and commercialization of education. There are several problems with submitting to the demands of the capital, actually. And I would say the first casualty of this submission to the demands of the capital is knowledge and critical thinking. And secondly, I feel that it will announce an end to all affirmative actions. Now, an end to all affirmative actions would naturally mean it will stop the upper mobility of the marginalized groups. There will be lack of inspiration in supporting decisions for people from the marginalized sections of the society. So if we look at the implications of the utopian and the utilitarian axis, the capitalist and the neo-nationalist, in other words, dimensions of the new education policy, you can see that it has the potential to marginalize those who are already on the margins, and it will consolidate the positions of the privileged caste or classes. Now, that's where the title of this talk becomes very relevant. Title of this panel discussion actually becomes very relevant, alienating the marginalized. So the new education policy possibly will have a marginalizing effect on the already marginalized class, caste, or religious groups. So keeping this in mind, I mean, I have made a kind of proposition, but I have not made any kind of argument in support of that. And I hope that we'll see the arguments behind this proposition in the discussion that follows. So with these initial words, I would actually go to Mr. Adil Rashid Khan, who has been behind the draft that you prepared and submitted on part of BASE to the relevant agencies, the draft, feedback on the draft on new education policy. So over to Adil Rashid Khan, please.
Thank you, Monirulda. Welcome and assalamu alaikum to everyone. Monirulda, is my voice audible? Is the audio all right? Or if someone can confirm that, please.
Yeah, audio is fine.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Abid. So, very good evening to everyone. Thank you so much, Monirulda, for setting up the context in such a brilliant fashion. It almost reminded me of my school days when I last studied English, after which, of course, we've not had the opportunity to study this brilliant subject. But my contribution in today's discussion will not be on the academic dissection of the NEP or its side effects or its positives or negatives on the academic development of the country, precisely because I am not an academician. Academics is not my core subject, and probably of all the panelists, I am the least experienced in academics to be commenting on the academic impact of this particular policy. What I will take the audience through today is more of the journey with which BASE started working in collaboration with other Indian pan-Indian organizations towards controlling the effects and understanding the larger impact of this policy. So I will take you through that journey of how BASE as an organization started working on this way back before, anyone uttered a word about it, and this was not in the news at all. And it started with one of my travels to Hyderabad to one of our education partners, MS Education Academy, to be precise. This is a this is a brilliant model of a large organization running very much on solid principles. They've got more than 100 campuses across the country. More important than that is the fact that this particular educational institute, it does a lot of research on tools and developmental methods of imparting education. So not only subject and syllabus related research, but also how to how to impart this education successfully into the larger masses, the so-called underprivileged masses, and the less elite sections of the society who are who are by default left out of our traditional educational processes. So they are part of a pan-India initiative called MFERD, Millet Foundation for Educational Research and Development. This organization is comprises of almost 6,000 to 7,000 educational institutes who meet every year to discuss the Indian educational sector and how different organizations can benefit by sharing each other's best practices. So we are also part of that, and through these sort of national gatherings, we got started talking about the draft policy, which was yet to be launched at that point in time. And then it was once the draft was released in June last year, and the deadlines were set for submitting the feedback by August. We started cracking at base on the document, and we started pooling in resources from different parts of West Bengal. Now, the crux of the matter was how to split probably a 400 odd page draft document amongst a group of 25-30 academicians, still being able to make much sense of it, to derive some cohesive feedback on what this policy aims at, or what this policy very diplomatically tries to put forward as the face of this country, as Monulda said, and basically the ulterior motives of this policy that needed to be studied in depth, along with the obvious technical impacts on education and different educational formats running in this country. So what we did was, operationally, we split the entire policy into different sections, and different sections were handed over to different base members who very diligently worked on the document. We had section level meetings at different stages, wherein the format of we finalized a common format of entering our feedback. We finalized a common structure of bifurcating our reasoning based on logic, based on prior examples, and of course based on references. So we were running the analysis of this document for almost like 1.5 months, and later on 2 months when the period was extended throughout different parts of Bengal. And I'm very much thankful, very much indebted to all the team members who successfully participated in this entire process. They were able to, we were able to, put our thoughts together in a very cohesive manner, in a very structured manner, because the feedback that was supposed to be submitted to the government of India was in their MHERD portal, and the structure of the feedback was very, very detailed, and it required us to quote references on each and every line. So aligning all of our efforts in one disciplined manner was the most important task. Simply writing pages and pages of feedback would not have resulted in us submitting a cohesive feedback to the government at that point in time. And finally, we were able to submit the feedback on time, and not only submit the feedback, we also generated a very useful, handy document, which basically, puts together all the perspectives into place, which take into account all the sections of the document, of the draft document. And we submitted our feedback, which ranged from preserving the heterogeneous nature of our civilization, in honoring different in honoring different vernaculars present in the country, as well as there are some very hard hitting feedbacks on why should one particular aspect of our culture be highlighted in our education system and not take into account the holistic nature of the country, and give enough respect to all cultures. For example, in the draft, they had proposed that sculpting and yoga and classical dance would be a part of the future of a student. So this, goes against quite a lot of cultures present in this country. We are a diverse country. So the essence of the document that we produced was preserving the constitutional value of India, and we were very much successful in putting forward our feedback to the government, precisely because of our discipline and our very organized structure of working in a very short span of time, because they made this policy in such, they researched the entire thing for 4 to 5 years, and they gave us only 1.5 months to give feedback. But we were able to give that feedback. We were able to generate a concise document on what they felt should be additions or deletions in the policy. And now when we see the final policy being released, we see some parts of our sentiments being echoed, but as is the nature of this pseudo democracy that we are currently living in, that all such processes have become just means of keeping certain resources engaged, whereas certain people take all the decisions, and we just allowed to implement those decisions in our daily lives. That has become the our everyday affair at the moment. So we see some reflection over there. We have communicated the base document with other organizations as well, pan India. It was very much appreciated by others, and they also exchanged their feedback and their outlooks. So what we have seen in this process is through this process of collaborating with different organizations, with this process of engaging different base members, we were at least in the draft stages able to see through the intricacies of this policy, and we were able to participate in a government process of analyzing its own decisions, which is a very good aspect of democracy. Adhering to the feedback or not, that is a separate matter of discussion. But overall, I think a lot of academicians in West Bengal benefited from this particular process by not only being able to dissect government policy at a threadbare level, but also expressing and exchanging views at a national level, which was only possible due to the leadership of this organization. And we feel that such inclusive participation is the strength that can help us achieve a more cohesive word or a more cohesive sentiment against the constitutional attacks that we might see in the future. So my request to everyone will be listen, participate, as well as be with us, but also contribute more in the future, so that we can become united as an entity and take such different processes forward. So Monil, over to you. That's it from my side. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Adil Bhai, for your precise presentation on how the base members and academics in Bengal prepared feedback on the draft policy. Now over to Atindra, who is dissecting the relevance of this policy for school education, especially in relation to the marginalized sections of the society. Atindra, please.
Yes, thank you, Anula. So before going into the where I have issues with the policy or uh, what can have a negative effect, we need to go to the vision, because uh, what I feel is that everybody audible? Others can hear me?
Yes, yes,
Yes.
yes.
So thing is that uh, vision can be very big. There's no doubt about it. It can be great also. But thing is that there's a difference between vision and what can be achieved on ground. That is two to three things. Even if to achieve that vision, steps are not taken in a correct way, or assumptions are not correct, then it can also have a negative. So first, I want to discuss a vision little bit, the most important part of the vision, and then I will come to where it could have problems. So basically, this vision, particularly related to education, this is a UNO goal, that is 2030 agenda, which India has become adopted it in, and said that it will implement or achieve this vision by 2030. Means now it is 2020, means within 10 years at most, or 2040 it is going to achieve the vision. Practically the UNO goal, the Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is inclusive and equitable education for and lifelong education for all by 2030. Now there's two things. One is inclusive, which means till now we have two set of schooling system. One was a normal or standard schooling system we used to do, and one was separate, which is special school. So special school can have autistic childs, or a child with special needs, and there were blind school and other special needs children. Now, as per new experiments and research, the outcome of these education is better if these children with special needs are also included or integrated with a normal standard school, which I will not tell it normal school, standard school. So this is one thing. That means even if we have whatever infrastructure we have, that infrastructure should be expanded to include with teachers and other materials for this special educations. This should also be added up. This is one. Second is that equitable. Equitable means it's not equality, as we all know. So for tribal areas or marginalized section, those will be given special attentions via scholarship or maybe libraries or anything. So this is the main vision, or vision in a small sense, which is the UNO vision, which has been adopted by India. So now, if you can understand this, so you can have a little bit of view the present condition of our education system and what we are aiming for, what is the difference, or what is how much scale we have to achieve. This is the one thing. Second is that in this normal now, which is primary and secondary school, which is structure, one more extra element has been added, which was not regularized initially. That is our preschool part, which is kindergarten. Basically, we're gradually moving on to the American part. This is K-12 system, kindergarten and 12 system. So that part, which was not regularized or not standardized, will also be should be added. So in a width, we are adding two different type of schooling system, and then we are expanding or elongating the total schooling years by adding it. So as per they are trying to do is, they are wherever possible, where the Anganwadis or other things are available, they are trying to integrate it. Wherever not possible, they are going to finance, or they are going to invest in more infrastructure. So from there you can view this is a grand scale of things. So this is the thing, and this has to be done according to their own scale, that is 2030, and they have given an extra 10 years, that is 2040. So that is 20 years we have to achieve this. So now when doing this thing, this is the vision. Vision can be anything. Vision can be great. There's a very great vision. Somebody on a surface level, it's a very great vision. But these will lead, has a chances of leading to, if not implemented well, there can be 2 to 3 problems can arise. 2 to 3 problems can issues can arise. I will initially I will just list few of them and talk few of them. Then, if the time permits, we can go beyond and other also. Any schooling system, there's basically 3 stakeholders. 3 stakeholders are, one is parents, second is students, and third is teachers. These are 3 stakeholders. 3 stakeholders. So now, what happens, what I have observed, generally students are not a stakeholder, practical sense. Main stakeholders are parents and teachers. Now, parents are given all the benefit. Teachers are generally come as the lowest of the pecking order. Almost they don't come into it. Now, if the schools in a particular area, say in a city, where the parents are very conscious, then the stakes increases, because the parents will be able to guide the career path of the student or their wards. So when in this schooling system, we are giving people chances to take many vocation and everything from, say, class 8 and beyond, which is very good in the sense. But the conscious parent, the parents who are conscious, they will be able to guide their children which vocational path is better, career wise, and in future or monetary wise. But those parents who are not conscious, which will be mostly marginalized parents, or parents coming from marginalized section, or first time educated parents, they will not be able to give the guidance to their children. This is the one thing. Second, from the teacher's point of view, what I see is that primarily the main headache, or what I say main concern of the teacher now, is not if the child is getting educated or not. That's not the primary concern. Primary concern is basically finishing the syllabus. That's the thing. How fast I can finish the syllabus. That is the main concern. So in that sense, when the assessment takes place, so this assessment, teachers are generally pressurized to give as good marks as possible. Now, as good marks as possible, even if the primary 2 assessment area, that is your numeracy, which is has to be done by now, and literacy, that is the primary education thing. Numbers, addition, subtractions, and you should know how to read and write, basic reading and writing. These are the structures. So this generally teachers are pressurized, because now the system is that it has to show that which school has given more percentage of pass or more able students. So what happens is that teachers are pressurized to give marks, even if, or give better assessment, even if the students are not capable to do basic numeracy. So now this will be more amplified in the rural section. This will be less amplified in cities, but I have also seen cities in even class 9 students not able to read and write. See, this is also. So these are basic. This can be discussed and expanded on. This is a second point. And third point, which is important for that is medium of instruction. Medium of instruction. It's not. I'm not talking about the language. 3 language policy. This is a separate matter. So third is medium of instruction. Medium of instruction. It's correct scientifically that in the if students are instructed in local language or some mother tongue, whichever area of the country or region of the country belong, in tribal area or whatever in area, they will be better equipped or better able to understand the basic concepts, particularly in the primacy area, when there's a basic development of numbers, language, and basic sciences, because till 8 years, the cognitive development and brain development happens till the age of 8. So that time it is very much important to give the main knowledge of numbers and calculations then only. So it's right that medium of instruction is better in local languages, but and this is the main problem with the policy, which says that till class 8 it is preferable, class 5 it is and preferably 8, and beyond that medium of instruction should be local or mother tongue, local or home language and mother tongue. But they are not denying that English cannot be used. What I believe is generally what is the best approach is to be bilingual. English should be there, and I am not talking English as a language. No, I am talking about English as a medium of instruction. So initial years there should be a bilingual approach. Obviously, মানে আমি বুঝাতে চাইছি কোন ছেলেকে বলছি আমে রং ক্রেয়ন্স দিয়ে লাল করো, and then telling us that yes, color the mango in red. So basically both, so that what I am telling to do or teaching or trying to give the instruction, those are well understood by the child, but gradually English should be picked up, and from 8th class onwards it should be a weaned away towards English. It's directed toward English, because like it or not, English is the language of the industry of the world. Maybe in future if English falls off, so that's a separate matter, but English is. So that proficiency should be there in the child. Otherwise, in competitive world, child will have a disadvantage. There's no doubt about it. There is no, I don't believe in those idealism. So that's the practical thing is this. Now problem is when they are telling that class till class 8, you can or you should or prefer local language. What does definitely happens is that private school will take it and they will use this bilingual and then preferably move to English. All the rules will be followed by government schools generally, and they will take it as teach everything in local language, and this will going to specifically happen in marginalized areas and sections, and gradually this may have a detrimental effect in growing up years when the real competition comes. So in that sense, I believe in I don't think that just this is good, you have to use a bilingual when one medium of instruction should be English. And lastly, for my part, I want to complete this in this area is that finally, when basically they are changing all the assessment way, how the schooling assessment is done. Obviously, this is a good comprehensive assessment is continuous, and comprehensive evaluation is being done. But problem is, whatever vocational training you take, means it's comprehensive assessment, or you are going for a professional course like mathematics and everything, whatever direction you take, it's my opinion that assessment should be strong. Assessment should not be weak. Second, what is thing is that they are telling the assessment will be very easy for others, but entrance they will encourage higher educations like IITs and NITs and others and private colleges to not just take the board and other exams, but also include the performance in Olympiads and other competitive examinations, so that coaching doesn't take. But there's a dichotomy here, because Olympiad and these things, when these becomes a way to judge students and intake them in higher education, then who is going to provide the education to crack or do better in Olympiad exam, mathematics Olympiad, chemistry Olympiad? That means those parents or families which have monetary and intellectual advancement already, they are will be able to invest in these, because this will be private tuition only, to crack these exams. And those from marginalized section who don't have the capability to prepare from Olympiad and other examinations, they will be left behind. So one part, we are decreasing the burden of exam, that we are say, but during the assessment period we are including some more exams which may have a detrimental effect when we are going to from schooling to we are going to colleges. That thing. So there are more points, but I think I have taken much time. So if there's other points, then we can discuss later. I think I conclude here.
Okay, thank you, Atindra.
Hmm.
Let us move on to our next panelist, Shreya. I think Shreya will take up from now.
Sure. Thank you, প্রফেসর মনিরুল। আর বেসকে অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ আমায় ডাকার জন্য। আই এম রিয়েলি গ্রেটফুল টু বেস ফর ইনভাইটিং মি। Am I audible?
Yeah, perfectly.
Yeah, it is quite a privilege to come and speak here. In the introduction itself, introduction is যেভাবে বলা হয়েছিল, I'll throw some light on the connection of the NEP 2020 with the labor question, with the employment and the labor question. To begin with, there's one thing that I want to say is that যে কোনো শিক্ষানীতিকে যাচাই করার জন্য তার কি এফেক্ট হবে, এটা আমার আগেও যিনি বলছিলেন তিনিও বললেন যে কি তার কি এফেক্ট হবে সেটা দিয়ে শিক্ষানীতিকে যাচাই করার প্রয়োজন। যে কোনো নীতিকে সেটা দিয়েই যাচাই করার প্রয়োজন। আমি একটা স্টেপ এগিয়ে বলবো, I'll take one step ahead and say that a lot of times it is said, look, a lot of things are basically implementational issue. The policy is actually very good, but its implementation has difficulties because our existing situation does not allow many good implementation, etc. So it's an execution problem. I will actually try to suggest that what policy can be implemented and what can be its consequence is known to everyone. I mean, not just to some of us who have studied the NEP, but I think is known to the vast population of India also, that what a particular policy, if executed in the context of India, can have its implementation. I'm sure the policymakers also have a sense of that. So I think it is just not an execution question. It also shows the intent of the NEP. It's just not an implementation question, it is also an intent question. And here the labor question, it becomes very important in the sense that what is the intention behind such a policy, and we therefore locate the policy in the larger context. I'll begin with one of the sections of the policy itself. One good thing about this policy has been that it has used a lot of words, মানে প্রচুর শব্দ ব্যবহার হয়েছে যেগুলো প্রচুর আকর্ষণীয় মনে হতে পারে, যেমন ফ্লেক্সিবল, মাল্টিডিসিপ্লিনারি, মানে নানান জায়গায় এই শব্দগুলোর প্রয়োগের কারণে এনইপি কে নানান ভাবে লোকে বলেছে যে কি না এটা তো ভালো, মানে ফ্লেক্সিবিলিটি আনবে, মাল্টিডিসিপ্লিনারিটি আনবে ইত্যাদি। কিন্তু এই ফ্লেক্সিবিলিটিটার মানে কি সেটা একটু যাচাই করে দেখা উচিত। সেকশন 4 যেটা বহু চর্চিত সেকশন এনইপি 2020, সেটা বলছে স্টুডেন্টস, আমি কোট করছি অলমোস্ট, স্টুডেন্টস would have the option of exiting after grade 10 to pursue vocational or any other courses available. তারপরে একটা সেকশন 4.27 সম্ভবত, সেটি বলছে যে কি 6th থেকে 8th গ্রেডের মধ্যে, between 6th and 8th, students can actually come out of one particular school and start doing internships and take any vocational courses like carpentry, gardening, etc. এগুলো শুনলে খুবই ভালো লাগে। প্রবলেমটা কোথায়? এখানে বলা হচ্ছে যে কি ক্লাস 6th and 8th এর মধ্যে ছাত্রছাত্রীরা ইন্টার্নশিপ করতে বেরিয়ে যেতে পারে, আর তাদের একটা এক্সিটের অপশন আছে। এই তথ্যটাকে, এই সেকশনটাকে আমার ধারণা পড়া উচিত ভারতবর্ষের এক্সিস্টিং সিচুয়েশনে, মানে the situation that is not given in the NEP. These two sections are there part of the NEP 2020, but what is missing in NEP 2020 is a particular data, that is the extent of dropout in our country, which is huge. মানে majority, and this is nothing to do with NEP or with 2020. For the last several decades in India, that has been the situation, that majority of our students after class 8 actually drop out. বেশিরভাগ ছাত্রছাত্রীরা আমাদের দেশে ক্লাস 8 স্পেশালি ক্লাস 10 10 অব্দি যদিও বা পড়তে পারলো, কিন্তু ক্লাস 8 থেকেই দেখা যায়, আর এগুলো অফিসিয়াল রেকর্ডস, যে আমাদের দেশে ড্রপ আউট ভীষণ হিউজ। এই তথ্যটা কোথাও এনইপিতে দেয়া নেই। এখন যদি সেই ড্রপ আউট রেটের সাথে আমরা সেকশন 4.2টাকে পড়ি, যে স্টুডেন্টস উইল হ্যাভ দি অপশন অফ এক্সিটিং আফটার গ্রেড 10, আর তার সাথে যদি আমরা এই তথ্যটাকে পড়ি যে কি আমাদের দেশে বেশিরভাগ স্টুডেন্টরা এমনিতেই ড্রপ আউট হয়ে যায়, তাহলে কি দৃশ্যটি দাঁড়াচ্ছে? এই জায়গাটা আমি একটু কনসেন্ট্রেট করার চেষ্টা করব, যেহেতু খুব কম সময়। ইন আ ওয়ে, এনইপি 2020 ইজ লেজিটিমাইজিং ড্রপ আউট, in the sense that anyways it did not need a NEP 2020 to say that after class 10 students can exit. Unfortunately, the condition of our economic and social scenario in India was that students were anyways exiting. They were not being able to complete their education. Most of our students, and here I think what is relevant because of the topic today also, is that who are the dropouts? A majority of our students drop out after class 8, and among the students who drop out, majority of them belong to the marginalized section. If we actually go into the ratios and the data of those who are dropping out, a large number of students in these dropout sections are either scheduled caste or belonging to marginalized caste and religion or socio-economically backward sections of the country. So in a way, therefore, what NEP did is that we were actually expecting a policy from the government which would actually say that we will not allow anyone to drop out. We will actually create a structure where we will ensure that everyone completes not just secondary education but higher education itself. But here comes a document which is actually saying that, and is actually cherishing the fact that we will allow it will allow exiting of students. That is one thing, which means dropout will be legitimized. এখন লেবার মার্কেটে আমরা চলে আসি। এই যে মানে এনইপি ছেড়ে দিন, এনইপি 2020 ছেড়ে দিন, তার আগেই বা কি সিনারিও ছিল? এই যে বহু সংখ্যক ছেলেমেয়েরা আমাদের দেশে স্পেশালি মার্জিনালাইজড সেকশনস এর ছেলেমেয়েরা যখন ড্রপ আউট হয়ে যান ক্লাস 6-এ, ক্লাস 8-এ, ম্যাক্সিমাম 10-এ, টুনে ক্লাস 10-এর পরে ড্রপ আউট হয়ে যান, তারা করেনটা কি? তারা আমাদের দেশে যে বিপুল ইনফর্মাল সেক্টর তৈরি হয়েছে, সেই বিপুল ইনফর্মাল সেক্টরে সাবজিউমড হয়ে যান, মানে অ্যাবসলিউটলি অ্যাট মিগার ওয়েজেস কাজ করেন। অ্যান্ড হিয়ার अगेन দ্য রেফারেন্স টু দ্য সেকশন 4.2, অ্যাকচুয়ালি অ্যাসিস্ট্যান্ট মিস্ত্রির জন্য কাজ করেন, ডেলি ওয়েজ কাজ করেন, মানে এগ্রিকালচার ছেড়ে দিন, এমনি কনস্ট্রাকশন সেক্টর, ম্যানুফ্যাকচারিং সেক্টর, সার্ভিস সেক্টর, এই সব জায়গায় তারা অ্যাবজর্বড হয়ে যাচ্ছে। ফলে আমরা দেখছি যে কি এই টেন্ডেন্সিটাকে আরো স্ট্রেংথেন করছে এনইপি 2020. The existing informal labor sector is being strengthened. One of the things that has been happening for the last 10 to 15 years, which is very stark, is that in the manufacturing sector, if you see, I'm leaving the service sector, manufacturing, I mean, in the service sector, informalization is very strong. What is happening in the manufacturing sector? There is hardly anything called a permanent worker, a worker who gets gratuity, a worker who gets PF benefits, a worker who gets medical insurance, a worker who will get compensation if his or her hand gets injured in a machine during any accident in the factory. All is gone. There is no permanent worker. Who is then actually producing? Who is the one who is working? There are various categories. There's a call that is coming, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Hello, am I audible? Yeah.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. So I'm so sorry. Yeah, a new category that has been created in manufacturing sector, which is called the DT, diploma trainee, or a category called intern. Now, instead of the permanent worker, much of the manufacturing, মানে ওরকমই 12 ঘন্টা কাজ, 12 থেকে 14 ঘন্টা কাজ ম্যানুফ্যাকচারিং করছে কে? ডিটি, ডিপ্লোমা ট্রেনি বলে একটা 18 থেকে 20 বছরের যুবক বা যুবতী, তাকে এমপ্লয় করা হচ্ছে এবং তাকে দিয়েই গোটা ম্যানুফ্যাকচারিংটা করা হচ্ছে। There is no permanent worker, and this DT, of course, you can understand what will be the remuneration. He's a or she is a trainee, so he or she will be given money, I mean given something as remuneration in that way only. But he or she is doing the work of as much work as a permanent worker should have done, without all the benefits and the wage that he or she should have been. If this is the scenario in which our country has been for the last 10-15 years, we see, and the sections that I read out, the NEP 2020 will only strengthen this, which means NEP 2020 will be creating a large section of cheap labor for the capital. And I think in the introductory remark, this was already mentioned, that how this entire policy is basically feeding into that. Because at the same time, we have to also remember that for a very long time, India has been only importing higher research, valuable things into our country, and exporting cheap labor, basically, in the sense that either import things from America, we import things from China, we import things from Japan, we import things from Germany. Basically, more high-end products are bought by India, are not created in India itself. And in India, what we are using our labor for, we are not products that we are buy from America, because if we start producing them in America, then who will buy it from America? Therefore, in the global capital system, we have actually become a country which is feeding the big capitalist and ourselves only providing cheap labor to various foreign investment or big capital investment in our own country. And the sections that I read from NEP and various other sections are actually feeding into that system of producing very cheap labor. মানে আমাদের দেশে যেই অবস্থা ছিল ইনফর্মালাইজেশনের সাথে, যে অবস্থাটা তৈরি হচ্ছিল, 22 to 25% of our people are only in unskilled labor job like construction, services, etc. The big question is that as NEP promises that it will create more skilled people. But the question is, even if we produce more skilled people, where will they get employment? Our problem is not whether we have less number of unskilled, semi-skilled or skilled people. Our problem is that we have enough skilled and semi-skilled people, but they don't have jobs. And this is not during the COVID-19 situation only. Even before that, as I think the audience today will be very aware, that unemployment has been a huge problem in India. So instead of fixing unemployment, I mean, there is no, even if you produce very skilled people, if they don't get jobs, it will actually not create any good future for the youth of the country. And therefore, and reduction of unemployment, reduction of informalization, creating more permanent jobs, all of this has clearly not happened. And we see an education policy which is also not anywhere close to providing that. So basically, the situation which was already there in the country, with a huge cheap informal sector growing, with construction, manufacturing, diploma trainees, with workers having absolutely no permanent wages, protection, and a large number of these lower income workers coming from the most marginalized sections of the society, who will actually never complete their higher education. All this is getting reinforced by NEP 2020 in the form of things like exit and entry agenda. I will just end with the fact is that this exit and entry thing and the flexibilization that is very much being talked about and being very popularized by the government, and many people are appreciating it. I will just have one question, that students who can afford very good education, will they actually exit the education system? Who will actually exit the education system? The large many of those who cannot afford, and those who will exit will actually not re-enter because there's an informal sector which will absorb that. So I'll just leave with those thoughts. Have taken a lot of time, but just to bring the point that the existing labor market requirements are only being fulfilled by NEP 2020 instead of promising education opportunities to complete education to large many students of India, especially the marginalized. I'll leave it here.
Okay. Thank you, Shreya. Let us move on to Asif, who will be taking up the higher education section of the new education policy. Asif, please, over to you.
Yeah. Hello. So am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So basically, for any marginalized sections of the society, if it wants to progress and be emancipated, one of the most important thing is the higher education. And Ambedkar also talked about this when he talked about the emancipation of the Dalits. Now the problem is, in the new education policy, after class 8 and 10, people will be enrolled in these vocational courses. Now what will happen? Suppose one of the parents earn through daily labor, or he's a migrant labor, or she's a migrant labor, or they are very poor family or lower middle class family. They generally will take the path that their child should earn early. So joto taratari income korte parbe tato bhalo. So they will move not towards higher education, they will rather move towards these vocational courses. These vocational courses almost will stop the path to higher education. Once you get admitted to the vocational courses, you will be skilled in that vocational courses. যদি মার্কেটে জব থাকে তাহলে তারা জব পেতেও পারে নাও পেতে পারে, সেটা আলাদা ব্যাপার। বাট the path towards the higher education and the collective emancipation of the community is now gone. তাহলে প্রশ্ন আসছে যে না, but why the vocational courses has many different branches, there will be a dedicated institutions ... These institutions will only serve some of the middle class and lower middle class who can choose, as Atindra already talked about, যারা বুঝতে পারবে যে না কোন ভোকেশনাল কোর্স করলে আমার ছেলে বা মেয়ে ঠিকঠাক হতে পারবে, তাহলে একটা সেকশন লোয়ার মিডল ক্লাস সেকশনকে দে ক্যান ক্যারি। বাট দ্য লার্জার কোয়েশ্চেন যে হায়ার এডুকেশন ইজ আ পাথ টু এমানসিপেশন ফর এ কমিউনিটি, that will not be addressed through these vocational courses. Another interesting thing is, in India, especially the caste system, এখানে একটা ব্যাপার আছে যে মানুষ through generations after generation take the same kind of occupation. For example, saloon or carpentry ... So in this case, the higher the path to, so what happened in the education after this independence, that many children went to the higher education and they broke the chain. এই যে কাস্টের যে চেইনটা ছিল, যে নাপিতের ছেলে নাপিত হবে, হ্যাঁ, বা কার্পেন্টারের ছেলে কার্পেন্টার হবে, বা কোনো লেবারের ছেলে লেবার হবে, that chain got broken by the higher education, not by the vocational courses. Vocational courses will in a way more rigidify this caste system and this class barrier. The caste barrier and the class barrier both will get rigidified. তাহলে প্রবলেম কি হচ্ছে, ভোকেশনাল কোর্সটা তাহলে হায়ার এডুকেশনের পাতে একটা ব্লক হয়ে দাঁড়াচ্ছে, এন্ড এক্সিস্টিং যে কাস্ট সিস্টেম যেখান থেকে ব্রেক করা দরকার ছিল সেটা ব্রেক না করে সে কাস্ট সিস্টেমটা আরো স্ট্রং হবে। নাও সাপোজ there are still people who will complete their education and go to the higher education. এখন আমরা জানি, we already know that in higher education, undergrad and postgraduates, most of the people who leave the courses in between are OBC, Dalits, etc. তাহলে যারা মার্জিনাল সেকশন থেকে ছিল they are already were dropping out in those courses, not completing the undergrad, not even becoming graduate. They used to drop out the courses. Recently, there was a criticism IIT on IIT that in IIT many of the Dalits and OBCs are dropping out after 1, 2, or 3 years. So what IIT did? IIT did a clever thing. IIT said that okay, after 3 years, if somebody drops out, we'll give him or her a BSc degree, and if he completes or she completes 4 years, that will give him or her BTech degree. So what happened? So this dropping out, আগে আইআইটি কে লোক ক্রিটিসাইজ করছিল, এখন স্টুডেন্টের কাছে অপশনটা আছে যে তুমি 3 বছর পরে তুমি বেরিয়ে যেতে পারো, you can drop out after 3 years, you can complete after 4 years. Now the responsibility has been shifted from institutions to the students. Not only that, the new education policy legitimized dropout at first year also. After first year of graduation, you can drop out, you will get some diploma. After second year, you can get some advanced diploma. After 3 years, there will be BSc. After 4 years, there will be BSc. So dropout has been legitimized and systemized in this new education system. But what happens after you get a 3-year BSc degree? Is there a path out? Okay. So in the new education policy, if you go through 11.1 to 11.10, you'll see that in the new case, if you complete your 3-year BSc program or BA program, there will be 2-year MSc program or MA program. In that 2 year, 1 year will be courses, complete courses, and 1 year will be complete research. So the research, your whole MSc will depend on this research, how good research you do. So after this, so whoever will be your professor, যে তোমার গাইড বা প্রফেসর হবে, তার হাতে সম্পূর্ণ ক্ষমতাটা থাকছে। তাহলে তিনি যদি তোমাকে রেকমেন্ড করেন, তোমাকে ঠিকঠাক গাইড করেন এক বছর, then well and good. But otherwise, the path তোমার হাত থেকে ব্যাপারটা চলে গেছে, এখন তোমার গাইডের হাতে চলে গেছে ব্যাপারটা। Now the fate of your life is on the hand of your guide, not on you. Those who will complete 4 years, তাদের কি advantage? They have to do 1 year course only, masters, and they also can go to the foreign countries and blah blah blah. They have all the options. They can directly join PhD also. So those who are going to complete 4 years and not drop out, they have all the advantages, and those who are dropping out, they have more and more obstacle in their higher education and research persuasions. So point is so basically this whoever dropouts before 4 years will have larger obstacles to overcome to do PhD. Now what will happen with the PhD? So there is a new rule that all the institutions will become more and more autonomous, and they have more leeway in deciding who to admit for PhD and who to not, and how much reservation they will follow. So even if you complete your MSc, now the new education policy makes it harder for marginalized section students to get a PhD and get admitted to PhD. And since the autonomy is with the institutions, PhD তে তোমার কি হবে, সেখানেও প্রোটেকশন কিন্তু আগের থেকে কম। তো ফলে starting from undergrad, masters and PhD, everywhere the obstacles has risen. কি করা উচিত ছিল? উচিত এটা ছিল যাতে লোক ড্রপ আউট না করে, লোক যাতে গ্রাজুয়েশন কমপ্লিট করে, মাস্টার্স কমপ্লিট করে, পিএইচডি তে যেতে পারে। সেই জায়গা থেকে সিচুয়েশনটা এখন এতটা এই জায়গায় চলে যাচ্ছে যে people will leave graduation after 1 year or 2 year. The dropout, there will be no policy against this dropout, because now they will say that okay, you have got your diploma after 1 year, fine, we are fine with this. So what we need to do, we need to make aware these marginalized sections that this is the structure now. If you drop out, the problem increases for you for your higher education. You cannot go to the foreign after 2 years graduation degree or 1 year graduation degree. 1 বছর 2 বছর graduation degree দিলে কেউ বাইরে কেউ তোমাকে নেবেন। ফলে you need a 4-year graduation degree or a master's degree to go to the foreign countries. So I think in conclusion, I will say that what we need to do, organizations like BASE and others, make people aware that in the new structure, don't drop out, complete your courses, and always aspire to complete the 4 years undergrad. And also we have to come under umbrella different organizations and make people and parents, students and parents aware, as well as the teachers who can help them, and as well as the local government, schools, colleges, and all of us. So thank you. That's how I'm concluding. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Asif. Now we'll move on to our last panelist for the day, Surya Majumdar. Surya, please.
থ্যাংক ইউ। শুরু করার আগে আমি আজকের প্রোগ্রাম যারা অর্গানাইজ করছে বেস আর বাকি টিমকে অনেক অনেক ধন্যবাদ জানাতে চাই যে আজকে আমার মানে একটা অপরচুনিটি দেওয়া হয়েছে আজকে আপনাদের সঙ্গে কথা বলার জন্য। শুরু করার আগে এটাও জানাতে চাইবো যে হয়তো অনেকেই এখানে আছে যারা শিক্ষা নিয়ে অনেক কাজ করেছে বা অর্গানাইজ করেছে। আমি সেই অর্থে আপনাদের মতোই হয়তো অনেকের মতোই একজন স্টুডেন্ট আর একজন যার জন্য সার্বজনিক শিক্ষা, পাবলিক ইউনিভার্সিটি বাঁচিয়ে রাখা একটা নিজের জন্য এক রকমের স্ট্রাগল। তো সেই দিক থেকে এই পলিসি ডকুমেন্টটার মধ্যে কি কি আছে নেই সেটাকে আমরাও বোঝার চেষ্টা করেছিলাম। তার জন্য কিছু কিছু পয়েন্ট বাকি স্পিকাররাও রেখেছে, আমি তার সঙ্গে জুড়তে চাইবো। টু বিগিন উইথ, I'd like to start with 3 things that were there in the document initially, but are not there in the final document. 3 things which were there in the draft since 2016, but the final document adopted during lockdown does not have. Adillah mentioned that initially there was no reference to constitutional values, and that was one of the suggestions given by BASE to the Education Ministry. What the earlier drafts had mentioned was bringing back ancient traditional values in India, revising those traditional values and enforcing them. It made no reference to the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which are constitutional values. This document, which has come after the massive mass movement of Indian citizens against the CAA, NRC, NPR, where the value of the constitution of citizenship rights and right-based claims by citizens over the government received a historic democratic upsurge, has forced the government to now again talk about the constitution and the values which are there in the constitution for all citizens. The second aspect, which was mentioned by Apindro, one of the speakers before, was about the policy of language. The policy mentions that now students will have the option of studying in their regional language or their mother tongue, and the regional language has been brought in. Before this, all drafts had been mentioning that only 2 languages will be taught in India, English and Hindi. But after massive protests, particularly from Tamil Nadu against Hindi imposition, this has also now been changed, and the new word that has been used is regional language. The last change from the initial draft in 2016, the draft had referred to what was the objective of this new policy that is coming after 36 years. The draft had mentioned that it wanted to prepare our country for the 4th industrial revolution. The 4th industrial revolution is a term that has been used by the World Economic Forum, one of the highest bodies which meets every year in Sweden, of the biggest corporations, multinational private corporations, some of the world's most powerful governments, and its leading academics and intellectuals and people from the media. And they discuss what should be the agenda for the crores of people who live on this planet. So the World Economic Forum's language had been almost copy-pasted onto a government policy that had come out. Interestingly, what we find in the final document is that has been toned down. Instead of the World Economic Forum, now it refers to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is also one of the speakers mentioned previously. So what I'm trying to say is that when we look at a policy document, and like before me, other speakers also mentioned, reading the language and reading the intent of the document are actually two different things. And we see from the changes that have been introduced into this policy what the real intent of the policy document was, and how far we as a united people have been able to change the agenda, or at least push the government on the defensive to shape a new kind of education system. Because we know that the limitations of our current education system are in front of all of us, and the speakers have already mentioned about how education and the larger social and economic hierarchy in our country is linked. And it is calling out for a revolutionary change in the education system to get rid of these kinds of hierarchies in the society at large. But this document, the National Education Policy 2020, does not lead in that direction. Rather, as but today's discussion is around about its impact on the marginalized, is something that we should be raising and should be asking to political representatives. Rather, instead of calling this the National Education Policy, we should rather refer to it as a National Exclusion Policy, because of the different ways in which this policy seeks to make public education less accessible and less of a right for citizens and more of a commodity which they can buy from the market, like any other soap or chips packet. Apart from the topics that have, the themes that have been spoken about at length related to privatization and commercialization, I would like to talk about the other ideological aspects of this document. One is the aspect of centralization that I would like to begin with. We know that education comes under the concurrent list in India, and it is managed by both the central and the state government. This particular document continues a tendency that was there even in the last NEP, which came out in 1986, towards concentrating power over education within fewer and fewer representatives in the central government, by constituting a new body directly under the Education Ministry, which will take over many of the functions today done with democratic consultation with state government representatives. Moreover, it creates a number of different new agencies, such as the National Research Fund, National Research Foundation, or the Higher Education Commission of India, which will also be under the central government and consist of nominated representatives from the government. So it will be a political nominee who will decide what students should or should not be researching, which kind of research proposals should or should not get funding, and it will be more and more detached from the needs of the people across the country, which has a huge diversity in a country like India. So that is the aspect of centralization. So the other aspect is of saffronization. We know we are currently being ruled by a government which has an out-and-out fundamentalist Hindutva agenda, and which wishes to impose a particular version of what it believes is the nation onto all citizens. We have seen before this in 2015, the Rajasthan government, when the BJP came to power, implemented a series of changes in the school textbooks. 8th standard to 10th standard and 12th standard textbooks were modified to eliminate certain chapters from history and add certain perspectives. For example, the importance of the Prime Minister's Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, or the importance of other recent schemes like Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. So we already have this experience. During this lockdown itself, we are seeing that the CBSE has implemented new reductions in the syllabi for school students. 30% syllabus has been reduced. And if you look at what has been done away with, chapters related to civic rights and duties, chapters related to secularism and debates surrounding secularism while the constitution was being written. In biology, chapters related to reproductive health, evolution. These kinds of chapters and the scientific understanding behind those chapters have been eliminated during the lockdown itself. So this being the context being that of us being ruled by a so-called social organization which has focused primarily on using education as a means to spread its version of what it believes to be nationalism through holding schools and camps in different parts of the country, will now be deciding the kind of education we will be receiving also. And recent newspaper reports after the NEP was launched shows that RSS representatives have said that apart from 40% of the suggestions that they had made, the rest of it has been accepted by this policy document, and they're happy, they're satisfied with what the document contains. One aspect of language has already been discussed about how English, by keeping it as an optional thing, by making implementation of regional languages contingent on the school where possible, that's what the document says, we will again be reinforcing the hierarchy between private and public school and English medium and regional languages rather further. So even if you are deprived of English medium education in your early years, if you're coming from a class of people who can afford to go to a high quality private school under the new model, you will have more avenues to pick up English at a later stage. But for the majority of people, and particularly for the marginalized section, we will have a higher differentiation coming in between the English educated and the non-English educated. Because of this widening divide between the government school and the private school. Another aspect which the document constantly talks about is that it wants to bring in the kind of education system which India had in ancient time from Nalanda and other kinds of universities, which we are all proud of. But while talking about all of this, it also mentions in the very next line that it will be shaped by the Ivy League model in America of Harvard and other kinds of private institutions in America. We know in the US and Europe, higher education is not accessible to the majority of students. Most students only go to school and very few can actually study in private Ivy League colleges. And the same kind of model now seeks to be implemented in India. Interestingly, while talking so much about ancient Indian tradition, the scientific basis on which India progressed, the different kinds of scientific developments in medicine, healthcare, agricultural practices, whether it be in the documented tradition or in the oral histories of the people who had been deprived of language. The kind of scientific innovation which had been made for so many years, we see actually there is nothing to substantiate that further. There is no increase in investment for higher education in the pure sciences or in the humanities, and for actual advanced research spending to go there. We know historically the third world countries like India have spent very little on advanced research and mostly at best to applied research. And this same trend continues unchallenged in the new policy as well. When Ayush, Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani and other traditional forms of medicine are spoken about, so there is no mention about how scientific research will be done in all of these kinds of natural medicine, but only about how there will be equal respect for Ayush and allopathic medicine, instead of actually increasing the scope for scientific research into Ayush. Similarly, we have a number of other references also where we are talking again and again about ancient values, but what were the real bases on which India had Indian people, including its most oppressed, for many years through their lives and livelihood had innovated, and the knowledge practices that we had gained, what is being done to advance that? There is nothing in the national education policy. In this idea of a religious fundamentalist idea of a new kind of India, the role of right-based claims from the government, such as the role of reservation, is being completely done away with. We know that in our country, according to data put out by the All India Forum for Right to Education, the number of students who can complete school education from 1st standard to 12th standard is about 6% for the scheduled tribe, 8% for scheduled caste, 9% for Muslims and other religious minorities, and 10% for the other backward classes. So the majority of Indian students particularly from the marginalized, are not even being able to complete their schooling, let alone go into a higher education public university and claim reservation. Without challenging any of that and rather enabling this kind of a dropout, on the question of reservations also, we are seeing a continuation of a tendency that this government has constantly embraced, which is to replace social and cultural basis for giving positive discrimination such as reservation and other kinds of positive affirmation policies. It wants to replace that with an economic basis. So recently we had the economically weaker sections quota being given, which has also been called an upper caste quota, which makes financial status a condition and does not recognize the social backwardness, which is the real basis for giving reservation in the constitution. And this attack continues once again in this particular NEP also, which now has, along with constitutional values, mentioned social justice once or twice, but says nothing about how reservations that exist also are not even fulfilled in public employment or public education. Lastly, I would like to point out that the current focus, which has been to replace economic criteria with social criteria with economic criteria, is actually something we find in the public-private partnership model, which implements a dual fee structure. We have seen new institutions like the Tata Institute of Social Science or a few other institutions based on this model, which says we won't have low fees or no fees for students. We won't have reservations in the way it is mandated for OBC and other socially backward communities. Instead, we will give economic incentives in the marketplace for education consumers to be able to afford education. So we will give a few scholarships. We will make education free as an act of charity for a few students, but the majority of students will be paying market rate price at whatever the market rate may be, which is 50,000, 80,000 over a lakh, and different kinds of for higher education. And a few people will get this benevolence or charity from the state. So we are seeing a replacement of right-based claims over education by a commodity-based kind of educational exchange, where who can afford for education will buy it, and a few people will be given charity to be able to include it in this otherwise hierarchical and oppressive education structure. All in all, with these three agendas of privatization, centralization, and saffronization, which the National Education Policy documents and makes formally adopts, we are seeing a combined attack on critical thinking and reason. We know very recently we are seeing the use of draconian laws, black laws, being used to put anyone who's a political opponent of the ruling regime into the prison, and other kinds of democratic liberties are being curtailed. And at the same time, we are also seeing that those people who spoke about rationality, who fought against superstition, like Narendra Dabholkar, Gauri Lankesh, Comrade Govind Pansare, and these kinds of rationalists and thinkers being killed for speaking about reason and equality. So we are seeing that through the national education policy itself, this attack on scientific thinking, on equality, and on rationality is being made a part of state policy. So while reading this document, I'd just like to share some of these threats which face all of us. And like I began with, the effect that a united demand-based citizens movement on the government has actually been able to push back and win from the government. In conclusion, I would just like to mention that in 1968, when the first national education policy was adopted by a newly independent country, just 20 years, 2 decades after independence, a Kothari Commission was constituted and the report was adopted by the parliament. The Kothari Commission had recommended that if India wants to actually remain independent and the independence that we gained by fighting against the colonial rulers has to be protected, then we must forge an independent education policy. And the bedrock of that education policy would be a common school system where any student, regardless of whether that person is the Prime Minister or Anil or Ambani or Adani's son, or the daughter of someone who works on a daily wage, will be forced to go into the same government school and get the same kind of quality, affordable education. That was a policy recommendation by a government panel accepted by Parliament in 1968. But today, it seems like an utopia. It seems like a radical idea that cannot actually be implemented. So it shows how, in the level of discourse, in the level of certain ideas, these ideas have been pushed back continuously. At the same time, how today we have the potential and we have been able to, when citizens come together and make these demands, to win these rights. And on that note of optimism and that possibility of building up such a movement for education for all, which our ancestors and revolutionaries before us, like Jyotirao Phule, Savitribai Phule, Fatima Sheikh, Bhagat Singh, Dr. Ambedkar, Periyar, and so many others fought for their whole lives to work towards an India of that imagination. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Okay, thank you, Surya, for your fine insights. Now, you see, we propose that we'll be getting back for 3 minutes of afterthoughts, but we are already, exceeded the limit. I mean, most of us have spoken for more than 15 minutes. So I think it will be better to take questions and express our thoughts in the process of answering them. Okay, so Abid, could you just take up and coordinate the question answer session? If any questions are coming from the audience.
As of now, no questions have been written in the chat box. So I have again given a message for them to write questions.
So then should I summarize the discussion and wait for the questions to come if any of them comes up? Okay. So we started this panel with an introduction by me, followed by Mr. Adil Khan's talk on the necessity of collective effort in producing feedback to the draft. And he also was talking about the needs to preserve the diversity and putting some kind of a pressure to the government by getting together, making collective efforts. Atindra actually talked about the disparity, the gap between the aims and vision of the policy and its implementation. And he has been referring to basically the school education. He also made some point on the quality compromise and the problems relating to the use of local languages and English as a medium of instruction. Shreya made some very good points regarding the process of legitimizing the dropout and the people who actually are dropping out or will drop out. She also made a very good point, I think, regarding the relation between skill and employment. I mean, and she has illustrated the point that whether skilled or unskilled laborers or unskilled people are there in India, but there is a lack of employment. So the new policy is not looking into, or the government policies as a whole are not looking into the issues of employment. Rather, they are focusing on institutionalizing and legitimizing the dropouts. Okay, so Asif, when you come to Asif, he took up the issues of dropout rates, and he pointed to the facts that it is the OBCs and Dalits who are dropping out from institutions of higher education. And for the OBCs and the Dalits, it will become harder to get into the higher educational institutions and pursue higher degrees, given the new policy that the government is trying to implement. Surya, the last panelist, has made some very good points. Basically, he focused on, as he said, centralization, saffronization, and privatization. So altogether, it has been a very good discussion on the new education policy. And basically, the panelists have highlighted the problems. Obviously, there are certain prospects, certain good aspects. But as many of the panelists pointed out, I mean, the verbose language on the one hand, and the real intent of the present ruling dispensation, I mean, there is a huge gap between the two. So given this, you know, these apprehensions are quite real. So with this, I would request Abid to check up questions if any.
Yeah, there is a question from Subhash Arya. Can any panelist suggest how to control the damage that is going to give with NEP on Mool Nivasi Bahujan people?
Okay. So anybody? I mean, I think Asif, Surya, and Shreya, three of them can respond to this.
Sure. Asif, do you want to? I mean, it's very difficult to suggest how damage will be controlled, because clearly the marginalized section will be at a very devastating receiving end of the NEP. I think one of the damage control, I'm not speaking in terms of damage control, but I think one of the demands that we have to raise from the Mool Nivasi Bahujan sections of the society, from those who will be adversely affected, is, I think, something that I will take a cue from Shaurya's presentation also, which has been a long-standing demand, in the sense that provide equal and good quality education to all. So, I mean, education has to be taken up by, like health, education has to be taken up by the state more seriously, where this where, whether you are, which caste you belong to, what was your family background, what was the source of income of your family, which area you belong to, which language you speak, whether your parents are English speaking in the sense fluent English speaking people or not. These should not affect the fortune and future of the people, of the future generation. So one of the demands that has to be clearly raised is that implement common school education. I think one of the, I mean, damages can be only controlled through a united demand that implement common school education, where a Mool Nivasi, where a Bahujan, where the son or the daughter of Ambani will go to similar quality education system. I think that can be one of the way out.
Yeah, I would also like to contribute. So Subhas, one of the most problematic part of this NEP is also that this vocational training courses. So previously, the lower background and lower caste people used to go to the higher education, and his families, he became the first graduate or first masters in the family, and that in the next generation culminated in better and better education for the next and next generations. So that was the cycle that was recently being created by those who got the higher education. So this process of getting higher education and setting an example for your family, for your society, and for your locality, that should continue. And vocational training should not be a bar for that. And we have to remember, we have to make the parents aware. We have to go to them, we have to talk to them, we have to tell them that if you want your family to break free of the mode of work you are doing, he or she has to go to the higher education. He or she has to get the higher skill and other form of professional education as well. And that for that, parents as well as students need to be talked to, and all the organizations who are working for Dalits and OBCs and Bahujans should take up this work and to interact with them and make them understand. I think, yeah.
Can I come say something?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. So basically, I will in some of the schools which are in tribal areas, say in Jharkhand. So few of the experiences, or what happens is that till class 5, till class 5 generally, the good students in those who perform better in your tribal background, they perform better. In a sense, they perform better than other students, those who are coming from non-tribal backgrounds, those whose parents and sir from a good position. Problem starts from after class 5. So because we have to understand the problem, then we can suggest some solution. So what happens is that till class 5, a student can study on their own up to class 5, because whatever your higher education career depends if you are finishing school or not, and in a good position. So till class 5, they are able to cope up with these studies on their own. But after class 5, you need an extra guidance, which are given by the parents who are from well-off families. So, but in tribal families or first generation tribal educated families, the parents are not able to give those guidance. This is the one thing. So after that, the dropout starts. Till 5, they don't drop out. Till 5, even many of the cases, they are better than other students because they are able to cope up with the study. But after 5, they drop out. Thing is that for this, what I prefer, if there is a high quality residential school, means after school work, you have to provide them guidance. The guidance which they are not going to get. We cannot teach their parents. You have to teach. You can't teach their parents, because what are they going to be conscious about? They don't have the real implications of the world. They don't. That's what I am saying. The parents, the stakeholder, they don't know what you are going to teach the parent. What are you going to say the parent that your son or daughter is going to be a good position if they continue? They don't know about it. The thing is, they have to keep them in the schooling system. For one thing is, there should be a residential school. Means after school work, they should get a good library, and there will be after hour schooling too, the kind of tuition which other parents give. So that is one of the way. They have to make them finish school, one, and those schools should have career counselors. These 2 points can make them choose the right career during school. That is the part of vocational training, or if they want to go for science, mathematics, and social science, humanities in the general field, they have to go. So those times, that is the only way they have to go. Even some teachers say, even during the summer vacation. The summer vacation, if you those who are educated, they know in Salem family, during summer vacation, city children and those from township, when they go back their home, they do summer homeworks. It's very important. They're continuously into education. But when the tribal families, they go back, there's no question. They're completely detached from their studies. So they lag behind. They have to come back in school, and again they have to start. The thing is that these residential school or whatever school they have in the summer vacation too, they have to make sure they are involved in education. They are not leaving because they are not going to get any support from school, from home itself. That's my thing. Then this can be mitigated. Then the higher studies, there are other way they can be tackled. So this is my point.
Okay, thank you, Atindra. Anybody else would like to respond to this? Is there any other question?
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
No, I think
Yeah.
the other speakers have already covered.
Okay. So, any other question?
Yeah, next question is that as seen, there are many problems with implementation of the NEP. How and why were those overlooked by the makers, and how or why of those need to be addressed except private intervention?
Okay, I mean, I think this issue has been talked about by Shreya. She was talking about not just about the education question, but was about the intent question as well. I mean, this gap, as she suggested, might be, intentionally created or led to be there. So, Shreya, would you like to respond to this?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, I would like to say that to understand why this was done the way the policymakers did it, one has to also understand the larger global system we are in. I mean, a lot of people said that we want to follow. I mean, there is an American model imprint in the NEP 2020 draft as well as what was adopted, etc. Now, one has to understand that something that I was referring to, that India has been over the years turned into a specific position in the global chain. Global chain in the sense that there are first world countries which produce a lot of high technology. It is America, it is Germany, it is Japan, and countries like India are actually buying those high technology from those big countries. Those big countries cannot sell their high technology just to their own home countries and generate profit. They need other people to buy it. And India, over the years, has turned out to be one such country that has been buying the high technology that is produced in other countries. Therefore, what has happened is that in our NEP, it is very clear. Since policymakers want to do that, I mean, the government, successive governments in India have actually followed this larger policy at the global level, that we will actually be buyer of higher technology from first world and advanced countries. Therefore, our own education policy does not have mention or does not have an intent to develop our towards completing higher education, towards to avenues to actually use their creativity, apart from a very small section like 0.5% of the entire youth. Rest of the youth is not encouraged to use their own creativity towards, whether it's in the manufacturing field, whether it's in technology field, etc., because we don't produce our own high technology, we buy it from others. All this, to be able to implement it on ground, NEP is basically showing a policy where where the thrust is that majority of our people will only be cheap labor producing smaller scale manufacturing and services, and not actually go about doing higher skilled research, which has been, and across sections, and from marginalized to every section getting the opportunity to use their own creativity to do that. So all this is also part of the larger policies that Government of India over the years has been following. There are a lot of other things one can add, but one can actually see it from the perspective of what the government actually wants in terms of other sectors also.
Okay. Anybody else would respond to
Just
this?
from the question, I think what the person asking this question, I think, is also asking about, apart from private intervention, what other safeguard is there? I think there, I mean, at the technical level, how the NEP has been brought about has been very problematic also, because it has been passed by the cabinet without any discussion in the parliament after the draft was given out, like was mentioned, with a very short time for consultation. So on those fronts, because we know we have a super majoritarian government in the legislature, lower house of parliament, all of this is getting passed without any kind of safeguard. At the state level, there has been some kind of opposition to these kinds of policies, but we have seen that even non BJP governments in different states have actually welcomed NEP formally. Even opposition parties have formally said that we appreciate the agenda or the intention behind the policy. The execution might be a problem. So we see that different political outfits are also agreeing on the broad objective, which we, all of us, I think, were discussing, have problems with. And lastly, I think we see different state governments also having failed to, in that sense, oppose NEP on the ground, because we are seeing all this privatization of schools, for example, happening in Jharkhand for many years, even under non-BJP governments. Right now, two big movements are happening, one in Ambedkar University, Delhi, and one in Kazi Nazrul University, Asansol in Bengal, which are under state government, but which are fighting against fee hike and getting rid of other protections for the marginalized. So in that way, I think on those legislative and executive fronts, there are very few protections left. On the matter of judiciary, the judiciary does not intervene in policy matters. So the moment a national education policy is formally adopted, the Supreme Court will say that we cannot intervene in this. The fourth pillar of democracy, quote unquote, the media, we have seen has wholeheartedly welcomed this policy, including those sections of the media which would otherwise be a bit critical of the government. So on those fronts, then what do we have left? I think there again, we have to turn to what has actually succeeded in changing the policy itself, which has been the big mass movement for a wide range of issues, from linguistic imposition to citizenship rights and so on. So I think I don't know if those details somehow clarify why the urgency of a mass movement of citizens is needed for an issue like education.
Thank you, Sharia. So, any other question?
No, there are no other questions as such. So I would like Jahira to present the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much. Abid, just confirm, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay, thank you so much. Good evening to everyone. I'm really thankful to BASE for giving me this opportunity to convey the words of appreciation, and thanks to the speakers of today's panel. Today's session was indeed very engaging and has addressed one of the most relevant issues of the day. For this wonderful panel on alienating the marginalized, impact of National Education Policy 2020, on behalf of BASE lecture team, I would like to extend thanks to all our respected speakers today. I extend our thanks to the moderator of today's session, Dr. Monirul Islam, Assistant Professor, Presidency University, for moderating the session so efficiently. I would also extend thanks to our speakers today, Atindra Kanti Mondol, Research Scholar, IIT Bombay, Adil Rashid Khan, Consultant of Hidayah Foundation and BASE, Shreya Ghosh, Research Scholar, JNU, Ashif Akram, Research Scholar, IIT Bombay, Shaurya Majumdar, student of JNU. We, the BASE lecture team, extend our heartfelt thanks and appreciations to all of you for sharing your valuable perspectives on how we can place the marginalized students who are evidently rendered more marginalized in the new NEP. Thank you so much for such an engaging discussion. I would also like to extend thanks and congratulations to the lecture team who have been putting up a wonderful job of conducting such a successful lecture series. I must also extend my thanks and congratulations to BASE President, Vice President, GAs, and all other members who have been directly or indirectly associated with this lecture series. Last but not the least, on behalf of BASE, I convey thanks and gratitude to our audience and respected delegates for their constant support, which has made BASE lecture series so successful. So I thank everyone on behalf of BASE. With this, I would like to announce that the next lecture, BASE lecture number 50, is on 19th September, Saturday, 7 p.m. onwards. In our next lecture, Dr. Sala Punathil will be talking on the crisis of citizenship in contemporary India. We invite everyone present here to the next lecture for the discussion on one of the most relevant issues that we all are dealing with. So thanks again to all of you for your support and encouragement. Wish you all a wonderful evening. Stay safe. Take care. Thank you. Abid, over to you.
Okay, before signing off, I would like our Treasury Abdul Matin sir to speak something.
What I will speak already over. Congratulations to all our panelists, Swedi, Monirulda, excellent, and Asif and all our esteemed speakers.
Okay, now I'd like everyone to leave the lecture. Thanks for joining with us and being with us for the last 2.5 months. We have conducted 50 lectures and we are looking to add some more figures to that. Thank you. Good night. Please leave this point. Please leave this Google Meet.